The $250,000 fine was sitting on my kitchen table when the federal vehicles stopped outside my gate. I still remember the sound before I saw them. The low hum of engines rolling over my gravel driveway. The crunch of tires against the stones my father had placed there 30 years earlier. The smell of fresh coffee mixing with the cold morning air as I stood there holding a letter that was supposed to scare me into surrender. Willow Creek Estates HOA President Victoria Whitmore had officially declared that I had violated community rules. According to her carefully worded notice, I owed the association $250,000 for unauthorized property use, boundary violations, and refusing to comply with neighborhood standards. She had printed everything on expensive paper, stamped it with the HOA seal, and delivered it with the confidence of someone who believed a title on a piece of paper made her untouchable. What Victoria did not know was that the people stepping out of those vehicles were not there to inspect me. They were there because of her. My name is Daniel Carter, and before all of this happened, I was just trying to live quietly on the land my father left behind. I never wanted a fight with an HOA. I never wanted attention. I wanted the same thing most people want when they come home after a long day: peace, privacy, and a place that still feels like yours. My property sits on the edge of what used to be open countryside. 30 acres of rolling land outside town, with an old wooden fence, a small workshop, and a giant oak tree that my father planted when I was a kid. I can still remember the sound of his boots on the porch boards and the smell of sawdust drifting from the garage when he built that fence by hand. To me, it was never just land. It was a lifetime of memories measured in every fence post and every footstep. But Victoria Whitmore saw something different. She saw empty space on a map. She saw something she could control. For years, she had built her reputation as the woman who kept Willow Creek Estates perfect. Everyone knew her routine: the white SUV, the clipboard, the polite smile that never reached her eyes. She had a way of making every conversation feel like a warning. At first, I ignored the small complaints, the questions about my fence, the requests for documents I had already provided, the notices about things that had never been problems before. I figured she was just another HOA president who enjoyed rules a little too much. Then the $250,000 fine arrived. I opened that envelope expecting another ordinary complaint. Instead, I found a document designed to make me feel powerless. Victoria believed I would panic. She believed I would sell. She believed I would walk away from my own property because a neighborhood association told me to. She made one mistake. She assumed silence meant weakness. She never asked why I stayed calm. She never wondered why I kept every document my father left behind. And she definitely never expected the old records hidden beneath years of paperwork to bring federal surveyors to her front door. I learned something important about land long before I learned anything about paperwork. My father used to tell me that property is not just measured in acres. It is measured in memories, responsibility, and the promises people leave behind. When I was a kid, I thought he was just being sentimental. I did not understand it back then. But years later, standing in my kitchen with a $250,000 demand from the HOA in my hand, I finally understood exactly what he meant. My father, Michael Carter, bought this land in 1982 when the area around Willow Creek was nothing like it is today. There were no perfectly trimmed lawns, no matching mailboxes, and no neighborhood signs at every entrance. There were open fields, dirt roads, and families who knew each other by name. He was a carpenter by trade, the kind of man who could fix almost anything with his hands. The smell of fresh cut wood followed him everywhere. His old work gloves still hang inside my garage, worn smooth from decades of building, repairing, and taking care of what mattered. I spent my childhood following him around that property. I learned how to measure twice before cutting. I learned how to read the land by paying attention to small details: the slope of the ground, the direction of water after a storm, the location of every fence post. My father was not a surveyor, but he respected boundaries. He believed every line drawn on a map represented someone's hard work and someone's rights. When he passed away, leaving the property to me, I promised myself I would protect what he built. That did not mean fighting everyone who disagreed with me. It meant being patient. It meant being reasonable. That was why I initially tried to work with Victoria Whitmore. When Willow Creek Estates expanded closer to my property, I understood that things would change. More homes meant more rules, more meetings, and more people who wanted things organized. I was never against that. What bothered me was how quickly organization turned into control. Victoria did not just manage the HOA. She acted like she owned the neighborhood. I first noticed it when she started showing up near my fence line with her clipboard, asking questions that sounded friendly but felt like inspections. She would point towards sections of my property and say things like, "We need to make sure everything aligns with community expectations." The strange part was that my property was never part of the HOA. I had the documents proving it. I had the records showing the original boundaries. But Victoria always spoke with such confidence that many people simply believed her. That was her talent. She made assumptions sound like facts. She made opinions sound like regulations. The first time I challenged one of her notices, she smiled and said, "Daniel, everyone thinks they are the exception until they realize the rules apply to them too." I remember standing there on my driveway, feeling the afternoon sun on my shoulders, and hearing the wind move through the oak tree my father planted. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain everything. But something stopped me. Years working around land records taught me one thing. The truth does not need to be louder. It only needs to be documented. So I went back inside, opened the old filing cabinet in my office, and started looking through the papers my father had carefully saved for decades. I did not know it yet, but hidden among those aging documents was the one piece of information Victoria Whitmore never expected me to find. Victoria Whitmore had a way of making every room feel smaller the moment she walked into it. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to argue. She carried herself like someone who believed everyone around her had already agreed with her before she even spoke. By the time I finished searching through my father's old records, I finally understood why. For years, Victoria had built her reputation on one simple idea. If she sounded official enough, people would stop asking questions. Willow Creek Estates looked like a peaceful community from the outside. Fresh landscaping, clean streets, identical stone mailboxes, and houses that seemed carefully arranged like pieces on a chessboard. But behind those perfect lawns was a growing number of people who had learned to keep their opinions quiet. I started noticing it during neighborhood meetings. Someone would raise a concern, Victoria would make a note on her clipboard, and suddenly that person would stop talking. She had a talent for turning normal conversations into moments where people felt like they were being evaluated. The first time I attended one of those meetings, I sat in the back row and listened. The clubhouse smelled like fresh paint and coffee from the machine in the corner. Folding chairs scraped across the floor as neighbors settled in. Victoria stood at the front with a stack of papers and that familiar calm smile. "We are simply trying to maintain standards," she said. Those words sounded harmless. But I had started to recognize the pattern. Standards became restrictions. Restrictions became fines. And eventually, people stopped remembering where the HOA rules ended and where personal rights began. When my property became her focus, she treated it like another project to organize. She sent letters asking for surveys, documents, and explanations about my fence, my workshop, and the way I maintained my land. I answered politely every time. I provided copies of the records I had. I explained that my property was separate from the HOA boundaries. But Victoria never seemed interested in the answer. She seemed interested in getting the answer she wanted. One afternoon, she stood near my driveway while I was checking the old wooden fence line. The sun was dropping behind the oak trees, and the air smelled like dry grass and cedar from the nearby woods. She looked at the fence posts and shook her head. "Daniel, you really do not want this to become complicated," she said. It was not a threat. It was worse. It was said like advice from someone who believed they were doing me a favor. I looked at her clipboard and then back at my property. I thought about my father. I thought about all the years he spent maintaining this land without ever needing anyone's approval. That was when I realized Victoria's greatest advantage was not the HOA rules. It was that most people never took the time to read them. They trusted the person holding the clipboard. I went home that evening and continued reviewing my father's records. The paperwork was old. Some pages had faded edges. Some maps were folded so many times the creases had become permanent. But everything was there. Every boundary, every signature, every official mark. And then I found something that made me stop. A document dated decades earlier that did not match the story Victoria had been telling everyone. It was not just a mistake. It was the missing piece that explained why she was so determined to control my property. Victoria thought she was enforcing the rules. She never realized she was drawing attention to the one place where the truth was waiting to be discovered. The moment I saw the official notice on my front door, I knew Victoria Whitmore had stopped pretending this was about community standards. She had moved from asking questions to making demands. The paper was thick, expensive, and covered in carefully chosen legal language designed to make an ordinary homeowner feel defeated before they ever had a chance to respond. I remember standing there on my porch, feeling the rough wood beneath my hand, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood around me. A lawn mower in the distance, birds moving through the oak branches. The same peaceful sounds that had surrounded this property for decades. But now there was something different in the air. Pressure. Victoria had decided that my land was her next target. After I found the old document in my father's files, I started comparing it with every notice the HOA had sent me. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. The questions about my fence were not random. The requests for documents were not routine. Every step had been designed to create the appearance that I was the problem. She wanted the neighborhood to believe I was refusing to cooperate, when the truth was that I was simply refusing to surrender something I legally owned. A few days later, Victoria called an emergency HOA meeting. I heard about it from my neighbor, Thomas Reed, a retired teacher who lived 3 houses away. Thomas had always been the kind of person who watched more than he spoke. He told me the meeting room was packed. Victoria stood at the front with a presentation prepared, showing maps and photographs that made it look like my property was somehow affecting the entire community. She spoke about protecting property values. She spoke about maintaining order. She spoke about responsibility. But she never mentioned the one thing that mattered most, whether she actually had the authority to do what she was doing. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my father's records spread out in front of me. The old pages smelled like paper and dust from years of storage. Some documents had handwritten notes in the margins. Some had faded stamps from county offices. Every detail told a story, and every detail pointed back to the same fact. My property boundaries had been established long before Willow Creek Estates existed. Victoria was acting like she had discovered a problem. In reality, she had created one. The next morning, another letter arrived. This one was different. It was not a request. It was not a warning. It was a final demand. Victoria claimed I had violated multiple community regulations and that the HOA would pursue financial penalties if I did not comply. The number at the bottom made me stop for a moment. $250,000. It was so large that it almost looked unreal. I could imagine what she expected. She expected panic. She expected me to call her office and ask how to make it go away. She expected me to apologize for something I had never done. Instead, I placed the letter beside my father's old maps and opened a folder I had not touched in years. Because there was something Victoria never considered. Sometimes the strongest response is not an argument. Sometimes it is simply bringing the right records to the right people. The next morning, I stopped looking at Victoria Whitmore as someone who simply loved rules. I started looking at her as someone who had built an entire system around people being too afraid to question her. The difference mattered. Because once you stop reacting emotionally, you start seeing the pattern. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee growing cold beside me, surrounded by decades of documents my father had carefully saved. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional sound of wind moving through the oak tree outside. Every paper had a story. Every signature had a purpose. My father was not the kind of man who trusted memory alone. He believed paperwork protected honest people. After several hours of comparing the HOA notices with the original property records, I found something that changed everything. The boundary maps Victoria had been using were not the original records. They were newer copies created after Willow Creek Estates expanded. At first glance, the difference was almost impossible to notice. A small adjustment here, a changed line there, a few markings that looked harmless unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. But I did. My years working with land records taught me that the smallest details often reveal the biggest mistakes. The original survey from the early 1980s showed my property clearly. The fence line, the access path, the exact measurements. Everything matched what my father had always told me. But somewhere along the way, someone had created a version that made it appear like parts of my land belonged to the community. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the documents. I was not angry. Not yet. I was curious. Because mistakes happen. People make errors. Records get updated. But this was different. This was a story that had been repeated so many times that people stopped checking whether it was true. Later that afternoon, I spoke with Thomas Reed across the street. He stood on his front porch holding his newspaper, the same way he did almost every morning. He lowered his voice and told me something I had not expected. "Daniel, you are not the first person Victoria has pushed around." He explained that several neighbors had received confusing notices over the years. Some paid fees because they did not want conflict. Others simply gave up because fighting an HOA felt exhausting. That was when I realized this was bigger than my property. Victoria had created a culture where people accepted her version of reality because challenging it seemed harder than staying quiet. But I also realized something else. She had made one critical mistake. She had put everything in writing. Every demand, every accusation, every claim of authority, and written records have a way of surviving longer than intimidation. I carefully placed the original survey documents into a protective folder. Then I opened another file containing my professional contacts from years ago. I knew exactly who needed to see these records. I knew exactly what question needed to be answered. Was Victoria Whitmore enforcing legitimate rules, or was she building an entire neighborhood around a mistake? For the first time since this started, I felt calm. Because I was no longer trying to convince Victoria she was wrong. I was preparing to let the facts speak for themselves. The week after Robert Hayes reviewed the records, I noticed something strange about Willow Creek Estates. The neighborhood looked the same from the outside. The same perfectly trimmed lawns. The same stone entrances. The same quiet streets where sprinklers clicked every morning. But underneath that calm appearance, people were starting to ask questions. I could feel it every time I walked outside. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact were suddenly stopping to talk. They were not just curious about my situation anymore. They were curious about what they had been told for years. Victoria Whitmore had always relied on one thing more than anything else: people trusting her without checking the details. That was changing. I spent the next several days organizing every piece of information I had collected. The original property records, the older survey maps, the HOA notices, the letters Victoria sent. I placed everything in chronological order across my office desk. The room smelled like old paper and coffee, and the soft sound of pages moving reminded me of my father sitting at that same desk years earlier. He was the kind of man who saved every receipt, every contract, every document, because he believed details mattered. At the time, I thought he was being overly careful. Now I understood. Those small details were the reason I still had a way to prove the truth. Robert called me again after completing a deeper review. His voice was calm, but I could tell the information mattered. He explained that the issue was not just a disagreement over property lines. The records showed a much larger problem. The information used by the HOA did not match the original land records filed with the county. The difference was hidden in plain sight. A small adjustment on one document, a changed description on another, a boundary line that appeared to move without the proper foundation behind it. None of these details would stand out to someone casually looking at a map, but to someone who understood land records, they told a completely different story. I looked out my office window toward the old fence line and thought about how long this had been going on. How many people had accepted those decisions because they assumed the HOA had already done the homework? That was the part that bothered me most. Not the fine, not the letters. It was the idea that confidence had replaced accuracy. Victoria had built her authority around appearing certain. But certainty does not replace facts. The next morning, I made copies of everything. I created a complete record of what happened from the first notice to the final demand. I did not want rumors. I did not want arguments. I wanted a clear timeline that anyone could understand. That afternoon, I received another message from Victoria. She said the HOA was moving forward and expected my full cooperation. Her words were polite, but the meaning was obvious. She still believed she was in control. She still believed I was waiting for permission to defend what was mine. I read the message twice, then placed my phone on the desk beside the documents. For the first time, I smiled. Because Victoria did not realize the situation had already changed. She thought she was preparing the next step against me. She had no idea I was preparing the next step against the truth she had been hiding. The morning I decided to move forward, everything felt unusually quiet. I stood in my office with the original records spread across my desk, the same desk where my father had spent countless evenings organizing his own paperwork. The sunlight came through the window and landed across the old survey maps, highlighting every line and every mark that had been preserved for decades. I realized something important in that moment. This was never just about proving Victoria Whitmore wrong. It was about making sure the truth had a chance to be heard. I contacted the appropriate offices and submitted the documents for review. I did not make accusations. I did not demand attention. I simply provided the records and asked the one question that mattered. Were the current boundaries and claims supported by the official history of the property? While that process began, Victoria continued exactly as I expected. She acted like nothing had changed. The HOA sent another community update explaining that they were protecting neighborhood standards. She scheduled another meeting. She continued telling residents that everything was under control. But something about her confidence seemed different. It felt less like certainty and more like someone trying to convince themselves. A few days later, I saw her outside near the community entrance. She was speaking with several residents, holding her clipboard as usual. When she noticed me, she gave me the same polite smile she had used from the beginning. "Daniel, I hope you understand we are only doing what is best for everyone," she said. I looked at the neighborhood around us, the houses, the streets, the families who simply wanted to enjoy where they lived. Then I looked back at her. "I hope that is true, Victoria," I said, "because the records will show whether it was." For the first time, she did not immediately respond. It was only a brief moment, but I noticed it. A pause, a hesitation. Then she turned away and continued her conversation. That evening, Thomas Reed stopped by my house. He stood near the fence and looked across the property. "You know," he said, "I always wondered why nobody ever checked those maps." I told him the truth. Most people assume official-looking documents are automatically correct. They assume someone else already verified everything. Thomas nodded slowly. He understood. The following week moved quickly. I received confirmation that the records had been reviewed and that a formal field verification would be scheduled. That meant professional surveyors would come to examine the property lines using the original documentation and modern equipment. I kept the news private. I did not want a public argument. I did not want Victoria preparing a response before the facts were confirmed. I simply waited. And while I waited, I walked the land my father left me. I touched the old wooden fence posts. I stood beneath the oak tree. I listened to the wind moving through the branches. This place had carried my family's history for more than 40 years. It had survived storms, changes, and new developments. It did not need anyone's permission to exist. A few days later, I received the confirmation. The survey team was arriving. I looked out toward the driveway and remembered the confidence Victoria had shown from the beginning. She believed the documents she created would protect her. She never imagined the original ones would come back. And she certainly never expected the people who understood those records best would soon be standing on the ground she claimed to control. The morning the survey team arrived, I woke up before my alarm. I had spent years learning to trust evidence, but even I felt the weight of that moment. The house was quiet. The coffee maker clicked in the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room as I looked out the window toward the driveway. For decades, that view had represented home. That morning, it represented something else. It represented the moment when facts would finally catch up with assumptions. Around 9 in the morning, I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Not the familiar sounds of neighbors leaving for work or delivery trucks passing by. These were official vehicles moving slowly down the road. They stopped near my property entrance, and several survey professionals stepped out carrying equipment cases and documents. The neighborhood noticed immediately. Curtains moved. Garage doors opened. People who had spent months staying quiet suddenly wanted to know what was happening. I walked outside and greeted the team. They were calm, professional, and focused. There was no drama, no arguments, just people doing their job by following the records. That was something I appreciated. The truth did not need a performance. It only needed accuracy. They began reviewing the original documents, comparing them with the current maps, and examining the established markers around the property. I watched as they carefully measured distances and checked locations. Every step was deliberate. Every number mattered. Meanwhile, Victoria Whitmore arrived at the entrance of Willow Creek Estates. She looked confused at first, then concerned. She walked toward the survey team with the same confidence she had carried for months. The clipboard was still in her hand, the same clipboard that had represented authority to so many people. "Can I ask what this is regarding?" she said. One of the survey professionals calmly explained that they were conducting an official verification based on historical property records. Victoria looked toward me. For the first time since this entire situation started, she did not look like someone who had all the answers. She looked like someone who had just discovered there were questions she had never considered. I stayed quiet. I did not need to explain anything. The documents were already speaking. The survey team continued their work throughout the morning. They reviewed the original boundaries from the records my father had preserved. They compared those details with the information the HOA had been using. Slowly, the picture became clear. The property lines had a history that could not be changed simply because someone updated a community map. The land did not belong to whoever created the newest document. It belonged according to the official records. Several neighbors gathered nearby as the process continued. Thomas stood beside me, watching everything unfold. He leaned over and quietly said, "I think everyone is learning something today." He was right. This was not just about me proving a point. It was about reminding people that confidence and authority are not the same thing. Victoria had spent years convincing people that her version of events was the only version that mattered. But the land had its own story. The records had their own history. And now, those facts were standing in front of everyone. By the end of the day, the survey team packed up their equipment. They thanked me for providing the records and explained that the findings would move forward through the proper channels. I watched their vehicles leave the driveway and felt something I had not felt in months. Relief. Not because the situation was over, but because the truth had finally entered the room. Victoria had built her power around people not looking closely. She never expected someone to open the old files, read every line, and let the facts lead the way.